Okay, so yesterday we had a full day talking about zero knowledge, which obviously was great. And today I'm going to be talking more about zero knowledge. And specifically, I'm going to be starting at the point pretty much where Dan left off. So Dan was talking a lot about how you have the Plonk proving system and how it's using a different arithmetization system to possibly the one that lots of you are used to. Today what I'm going to do is I'm going to start building that constraint system really from the ground up. So you can sort of see where it's coming from, see the motivation behind a lot of the reasons why we're doing things in a specific way, and hopefully have a good understanding of how you would use this type of constraint system if you wanted to build some kind of program of your own. So the first thing I'm going to say, and I hope this isn't controversial in any way, is that prover time is a very important bottleneck when it comes to building snarks. So certainly we have that proof size and verifier time is important. We do care about it. But we've kind of got to the point where we have snarks where the proof size and the verifier time is almost as good as you can hope for. We don't actually have an impossibility result showing that it's the best that it could possibly be. But we do have an impossibility result showing that it's like 2/3 of how good it could possibly be if you're using like Grok 16 or something like that. However, when it comes to prover time, there's definitely still room to improve, especially when we're talking by constant factors, and we're getting into a very sort of practical realm now where constants very much do matter. And if you have a proof which happens to be a little bit on the big side, so perhaps you're working with a stack because that's got a very fast prover, you can always wrap it in a very small proof at the end using recursive type techniques, so that would still be something that would be very interesting if you can get that prover very, very fast. One thing also to note is that prover time is always going to directly depend on the size of the computation. This is pretty much unavoidable. You cannot prove something if you can't compute something. So we're always going to have at least a linear cost. Often we have more than a linear cost. Often we have a quasi-linear cost. And the size of your computation is something which is very variable, because you have to represent your computation in some way. And how you represent your computation can either have a huge amount of overhead or a very small amount of overhead, depending on how smart you are. So I'm going to bring up one of my favorite examples. I have used it in a presentation before, which is sort of saying, how are we going to go about representing the problem that y is equal to the inverse of x? So one sort of classic way that you might go about this is you might say, well, we've got Fermat's little theorem, which means that x to the minus 1 in a prime ordered field is actually x to the power of p minus 2. And p minus 2 is something that we can represent very, very easily, because that's something that exists in our field. So we can then compute x to the p minus 2 using a double and add method. We double it, then we add it if the bit is 0. If the bit is 1, we don't add it if it's 0, and we keep doing that a logarithmic number of times. And at the end, we just check directly that y is equal to x to the power of p minus 1. And this is something that would cost a logarithmic number of constraints in the size of p. I'm going to say that that first method was a very bad strategy for arithmetizing this problem, because while it's very smart, while there's lots of fun maths going on, actually you can just represent this in one constraint by just checking that x times y is equal to 1. And this would be then save you a whole logarithmic number of constraints in your overhead, which would make a difference to your prover time. So you would always want to go with the second strategy rather than the first strategy. Okay, so just an outline for today. Yesterday, Dan gave us a very nice talk about how the Plonk proving system actually works, and finished off working with the Plonkish arithmetization system. Plonkish is a term that was first coined by Dara, but now I'm using it and Dan's using it, so hopefully it's going to be something that everyone's using. Today, we're going to be taking a closer look first at just multiplication and addition constraints, so start from the basics. Then we're going to talk about copy constraints and how you might want to use those. Then we're going to talk about selector polynomials. And finally, we're going to finish talking about custom constraints, and I will talk about lookup constraints, but they're for the next talk. Okay, so a very simple example of a problem that we might want to prove. This is a problem that comes up time and time again. It's a range constraint. We want to check that x is within, here, a very small range. We want to check, not x, sorry, C3. We want to check that it's somewhere between 0 and 4. How would we do this using just multiplication gates? I'm going to claim that I think it's impossible. I don't have a nice result to point you to that, but I would be very surprised if it was possible. Because certainly you can check that A1 times B1 is equal to C1, but then how do you use that? If we have both multiplication and addition constraints, then we can say a bit more. We're still not going to be able to use it, surprise, surprise, but we can say more. Can you see that? That doesn't show up too well, does it? Okay. Okay, so one thing that we always try and do is we try and do binary decomposition when we're trying to have, when we're trying to say that something is within a range. So if we have that A1 is between 0 and 1, and we have that A2 is between 0 and 1, and we have that C3 is equal to A1 plus 2A2, then we know that C3 must be within the range 0 to 4.
This is over F2. These multiplication and addition, so what field?
Oh, they're over a prime ordered field.
Okay, sorry? But these are supposed to be bits, no?
Well, we have to check that they're bits, right?
Right. Okay.
Because the prover might choose that they're not bits. So in order to enforce that they're bits, when you're working over a prime ordered group, you've got to constrain them.
Okay, sorry? What do you claim about the possibility?
I'm going to say that if all you can do is multiplication constraints, you're going to have a very hard job proving that something is range constrained. I also think that addition gates, they help you a bit, but they're not going to solve the problem. So in particular, you are going to be able to prove that A1 is between 0 and 1. That would not be a problem.
Sorry, I'm confused. What's AI, what's BI?
So A1, B1, and C1 are just values that the prover has control over. It can decide whether it wants them to be equal to 5, or to 10, or to 15, or to 100. It can choose them to be whatever it likes, really. These are witness values. However, it does have to choose them such that they satisfy the constraints that are on the slides. So in this case, no matter what you choose A1, B1, C1 to be, you do need it to be the case that A1 plus B1 is equal to 1, and A1 plus B1 times B1 is equal to 0. Is that clear? Go. Okay, and the reason why it constrains us like this is because if we have that B1 is equal to 1 minus A1, and we have that A1 times 1 minus A1 is equal to 0, then it must be the case that the only way A1 could satisfy that is going to be if it's 0 or 1. However, while we can check that A1 is between 0 and 1, and we can check that B1 is between 0 and 1, we can't really check that C3 is equal to the sum of A1 plus 2A2. We just don't have the means to do it if all we have is multiplications and additions. Like, we need some kind of wiring to help us with this. And the way that the Plonkish arithmetization system is going to handle the wiring is with copy constraints. So I've got some example copy constraints up here. One of them I did forget, hence it's very, very small, because I forgot it quite late. But we have 4 copy constraints. We have that we want A4 is equal to A1. We have B4 is equal to B1, C4 is equal to 1, and C1 is equal to 0. I was cheating a little bit on the previous slide. I said, like, you've got these zeros and ones. If we actually wanted to enforce that, we would also need wiring. Once you have copy constraints, you have some wiring. So in this particular case, where A4 is equal to A1, we can check that, in fact, A1 plus B1 is equal to 1, which is what we're going to need in order to say that A1 is somewhere between 0 and 1. This is the same as before. And likewise, this time I'm not working with A2, I'm working with B2, and I'm saying that B2 is between 0 and 1, just because it's going to be convenient in a second. It's the same idea, it's the same constraints. But in the third step, we're now going to want to, so our binary decomposition was saying that A1 plus 2A2 is equal to our final value. But we don't have 2 times A2. We need to actually compute 2 times A2. How are we going to do that? We're going to do that with a multiplication constraint. So if you have that A3 is equal to a half, you can copy this in. And if you have that C3 is equal to B2, then a half times B3 is equal to C2, which is equal to B2. That implies that B3 is equal to 2 times B2. And half is something which exists in your field. You can work with that. Is everyone with me? Too fast, too slow? Maybe too slow? Okay. Okay, in our final step, we're going to have even more copy constraints. Our number of copy constraints is getting quite large now. I'm just sort of blanking out the ones that we've already considered so that we can focus on the last two. If we have that B6 is equal to B3, which is equal to 2 times B2, and we have that A6 is equal to A1, which is between 0 and 1, and B2 is between 0 and 1, and then finally, our very last constraint is going to give us that A1 plus 2 times B2 is equal to C6, which is going to give us that C6 is actually within our required range, which is what we're trying to show. My claim now is that while this constraint system, it works, if I am a prover, then I'm not going to be able to give you a value C6 which is not within that range because my constraints are such that this would be like literally impossible. However, I've kind of very conveniently here been leaving some sort of blank spots in the right-hand corner and the left-hand corner where you can't see anything that's going on there. And the reason I'm doing this is because I'm there like, well, there will be these nice selectors, which means that we can sort of remove those constraints. But you don't yet have selector polynomials. I've not given them in your constraint system. So what you would actually have is all of these additional constraints at all of these slots. You'd have to consider all of the addition constraints and all of the multiplication constraints. And in your very first slot, this A1 plus B1 is equal to C1. We have A1 times B1 is equal to C1 as well. Every slot is checking every constraint. We might have a situation where we're not able to satisfy this constraint when we do have a valid witness. So for example, if you have that C6 is equal to 3, this is between 0 and 4, it's a perfectly valid option, and the way you would constrain that is you'd then have that A1 is equal to 1 and B1 is equal to 1. However, when you add 1 plus 1, that's not going to be equal to 0 unless you happen to be working in FP2, which, for the sake of argument, let's assume we're not doing. So you would then have a situation where your honest prover is not able to convince your honest verifier, and your system is, in a way, over-constraining you. So in this situation, we have that the first gate is not satisfied by a correct witness, which is bad. So this leads us to the sort of final thing that we really, really need if we want to be able to prove interesting things. We have multiplications, and we have additions, and we have copy constraints, and we also need some selector polynomials. And our selector polynomials are going to do precisely the job of saying, at this point, I want you to apply addition, but at that point, I want you to apply multiplication, and at this slot, I want you to apply both. It's going to just say where you're doing what operation. So if our selector polynomials say turn on multiplication in slots 1, 2, 3, and turn on addition in slots 4, 5, 6, then this is going to give you exactly the constraint system, which I had like many slides ago now, this constraint system. And those blank spots, which look like blank spots there, are actually blank spots. So therefore, we're no longer over-constrained. We're no longer having to satisfy gates which we cannot satisfy. And this would be a valid constraint system. Okay, So my next plan is to talk a little bit about these copy constraints and how we're actually going to prove that the copy constraint works from a permutation argument. This is going to have quite a lot of overlap with Dan's slides from yesterday. However, it's such a cool argument that I couldn't resist putting it in again. I'm then going to talk about the selector polynomials, and I'm going to describe how those selector polynomials are actually going to look. Okay. So again, I'm working with an example. It's always nice to have an example in mind. And in this example, we have these 5 copy constraints that we're going to want to enforce. And we're going to want to enforce it just using a permutation argument as a backend. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take our public inputs. We do have 2 public inputs going on in these copy constraints. In particular, we have a half and we have 1. And we know what a half is and we know what 1 is, and we know that we want those values to be exactly equal to those inputs. So these are going to be public inputs. We also have a bunch of private inputs, our A's, our B's, our C's, and we're just going to line them all up in a row into a single vector. If we then kind of ignore what's actually on the inside of this vector commitment, and we sort of view it as just being a single vector commitment with all of these values to x, then this is something that we can then permute into a different vector y via a known permutation, which for this specific copy argument that we have going on here, we're going to want the permutation that's written on the board there, which is going to have just a sort of swap between 1 and 9, a swap between 2 and 4, a swap between 3 and 5, but a rotation between 6, 7, and 11. 8's not going anywhere, and 10's not going anywhere. If I actually plug in what's happening inside my witness into this permutation, so on the top we have our input, on the bottom we have a permutation of our input according to our known permutation, then this is actually going to, if these 2 values, these 2 vectors are equal, then we have that they must be equal in every single slot. So in particular, in the 3rd slot, we're going to have that A1 is in our first vector and A3 is in our second vector. And if these 2 are equal, then that exactly enforces that A1 is equal to A3. We also have this constraint is checked again. In the 5th slot, we're also checking that A3 is equal to A1, but that's fine. That's like, it's a constraint and it's satisfied, so the fact that we're checking it twice doesn't matter. For the second couple of constraints, we actually have more of a rotation situation going on. We have that B2 is equal to B1. This is something which we can then check in our, because those 2 line up. And likewise, we have that C3 is equal to B2. We can check that they line up. We again have an additional constraint, which is not a copy constraint, which is in our set of copy constraints that we actually want to check. In fact, we have that B1 is equal to B3, but again, because C3 is equal to B2, which is equal to B1, this is going to be satisfied, so the fact that we have an extra check there, it's satisfied, we don't care, we're happy. And this is likewise going to apply for the remaining 2 swaps. Finally, our unconstrained values, our permutation doesn't move those. So you end up with a constraint that C2 is equal to C2, which is equivalent to saying that C2 is completely unconstrained. How we actually then implement this permutation argument, Dan gave a very nice description of that yesterday, so I'm hoping it's all still fresh in your minds and you all remember it. If you want an alternative sort of place where you can read about it, learn a bit more, we did actually use exactly this trick in the kernel proofs argument, and we spent quite a lot of time on the documentation for that, so do check out the reference on the board. Any questions so far? Everything clear? Okay, not sure how to read that, but I'm going to assume yes. Okay, for our selector polynomials, remember where I was saying we really want to see selector polynomials as being a way to turn a constraint on. Okay, if you want to apply multiplication at slots 1, 3, you need a selector polynomial which is just going to turn it on at slots 1 and 3. So I'm now going to tell you that when we're representing our witness, our A, B, and C, we're not sort of viewing them as vectors so much, we're viewing them as polynomials, because everything we do everywhere ultimately boils down to polynomials. It's like the one trick we have. The basis that we're going to be using is going to be assuming that a of x is a polynomial, which when you evaluate it at a known point, typically this would be a root of unity, but for the point of clarity here, I'm just having that the point you're evaluating it at is I. Then you're going to have that a of I is equal to I. Likewise, b of I is equal to I, and c of I is equal to I. And those polynomials are going to encode your witness. Remember yesterday how we said that there is a zero check? So if you have the z of x, which is equal to the evaluation of x minus 1, 1 is one of the points in your domain, x times x minus 2, x minus 3, x minus 4, this polynomial is going to vanish at the points 1, 2, 3, and 4. So if you then have the equation which is checking that a of x times b of x minus c of x is equal to 0, this is going to be checking your multiplication constraints. In particular, the way you would check this is you would provide some q of x, and q of x can be whatever you want it to be, such that a of x times b of x minus c of x is equal to q of x times z of x. So as an example, if we just plug in the point 1, then we end up with a situation that we're checking that a1 times b1 minus c1 is equal to q1 times z of 1. Z of 1 is just equal to 0, that disappears. It's multiplied by q of 1, so that all goes to 0. So you end up with just a of 1 times b of 1 minus c of 1 is equal to 0. So a of 1 times b of 1 is equal to c of 1, and this constraint is going to be your multiplication constraint. And because your polynomial has to be satisfied at all points in the field, including the point 1, we actually have that this polynomial equation is going to be giving our multiplication constraint there. So when we then define our selector polynomial, we're going to be taking advantage of this, I'm going to call it Lagrange basis, or people often call it evaluation domain. And we're going to say, okay, let Sm of x, our selector polynomial for multiplications, be the polynomial which is going to be equal to 1 at the points where we want multiplication to be turned on. So it's equal to 1 at 1 and 3 in this example, and it's going to be equal to 0 where we want to turn multiplication off. And then we just multiply our selector polynomial times our constraints. So in the specific example of 1 and 3, in this situation, the selector polynomial takes that to 1, so you just end up with the equation that b1 times c1, a1 times b1 is equal to c1, a3 times b3 is equal to c3, and this constraint is satisfied. We can do exactly the same with addition. In addition, our zero test is going to look a little bit different. We're going to have a1 plus b of 1 is equal to q of x times z of x, but everything else is exactly the same. I'm not going to bother going through that. So in particular, our selector polynomial for addition is going to look the same as our selector for multiplication because we're turning on addition at slots 1 and 3 here. So we're just going to say that it's equal to 1 at the slots where we want it on, 0 where we want it off. Multiply our addition polynomial by SA of x. And then in this situation, again, we're going to end up with 4 constraints at the 4 points we care about. But 2 of those constraints are just going to disappear because SA of 2 is equal to 0, SA of 4 is equal to 0. You multiply that whole constraint by something that's equal to 0, you just get 0 is equal to 0, nothing's happening. So we're just left with the 2 constraints that we actually want, and they are the constraints that we want because the selector polynomial goes to 1 at those points. So that, again, just disappears in the way that we want it to. Yeah?
So in many branches of cryptography, we have this idea that additions always come for free. And I'm curious because here it seems that it's like, okay, you really pay for addition against 2. So have people looked at somehow?
Actually, that's a very good question. So when it comes to addition gates, if you're working with, say, Grot 16, then addition is completely free. You can ignore it because addition disappears in that constraint system. The same is not true with universal snarks. I'm going to say in general, I do not know of a universal snark where you get additions for free. because the system that we're talking about, the Plonkish arithmetization, is very much designed for universal snarks. And for those of you that aren't aware, a universal snark is not so far from a trusted setup snark like Grot16, in the sense that you still need a setup in order to generate your parameters, and you need that MPC to be carried out by parties who, at least one of them is honest, so you still have that going on. However, once you have the parameters, these are parameters that you can use for absolutely anything. They're just powers of tau. So if you change your application, or if you're maybe a small startup that doesn't have the means to run a trusted setup, what you can do is you can go to the internet, you can find one of these nice trusted setups that someone else has run in the past, someone who's done a very good job of that setup. You can download all of the parameters from that, and you can say, look, I'm working with these parameters from, let's say, the powers of any power of tau setup, and that's going to work for my system. And this is a big deal, really. It means that it goes from something that only people who are sort of very much know what they're doing and very good at getting the public involved and very good at running trusted setups can do, to something which pretty much anyone can do. But yeah, it does come at the cost of addition gates. So a lot of the things that we're describing here, we're going to have custom constraints, which are going to make things a lot easier. We're going to have lookup gates, which are going to make things a lot easier. All of this bringing down the prover time. And at the end of it, you're going to have something which is very comparable in speed to Grot16, which isn't using any of these tricks. And the reason for that is because we're paying for additions. As required.
So we made all the multiplication and addition constraints. How do we combine them all together? After multiplying by selector polynomial, do we add them up, or do we have them as separate equations?
So we have two equations here. We have our addition equation, and we have need to go back quite a bit, and we have our multiplication equation. We are going to have to check both of those equations, but the way it's actually done is it's kind of optimized. So you know that you're going to have to check your multiplication equation, and you know that you're going to have to check your addition equation. But where you're committed to A of x and B of x and C of x before you're computing these, and then you're going to evaluate them at a random point, what you can do is you can sum up these constraint polynomials at a random point. So you can sort of say, actually, I'm going to check the multiplication plus a random point times my addition polynomial and check that that's all equal to 0, which means that the point q of x that you're computing for the multiplication is going to be worked into the point q of x that you're computing for the addition, and you're only going to have to compute that point once, so we can optimize it quite nicely.
And how much do these selector polynomials contribute to the overall?
In this particular example, they are going to contribute to the overall degree. Wait, is that true? No, they're not really true, because the selector polynomials are committed to during the setup phase, not the trusted setup phase, but the pre-processing phase. Okay, I'm now going to talk about the sort of thing that I really want to cover in this lecture, and that's custom constraints. And again, I'm going to do it with a very example-based approach. The example I'm going to use is one that's sort of quite close to me right now, and that's an example of a verifiable delay function. So I'm not going to motivate the verifiable delay functions. I'm hoping that some of you know what they are. But the basic idea is that you want a good source of randomness, and in order to get a good source of randomness, what you're going to do is you're going to take a function and you're going to compute it over and over and over and over and over and over again. It's going to be very difficult to parallelize this function, so if you have a function that you need to compute 10 times, that should take you 10 times longer than computing this function one time. Okay, and what we're then going to do is we're going to prove that the final result of computing this function over and over and over and over again, we're going to check that that is correct inside a snark. The whole purpose of doing this is to try and make it so that we can have something which is unpredictable. You don't know what it's going to be equal to in advance, but it's also verifiable. You know that the result that people are giving to you is correct without recomputing it for yourself. Obviously, this is a very time-critical thing. Like the whole purpose of introducing this function is to try and have something that's very slow, but your prover is not really part of this slow function. So if you have that your prover is taking 100 times the amount of time it takes you to compute your function, then that's going to give you 100 times overhead, which is not really great. You want your prover to be keeping up with your computation as much as possible. The min-root candidate VDF function is one that we are sort of considering fairly seriously. It very much needs more analysis at this point before it can be considered seriously. So if there's any cryptanalysis in the room, please do have a look at it and see if you can break it. Currently, the way it's working is that you have xi and yi. These are two separate points. And at each step of the function, you want to check that your new xi and yi are equal to the old xi plus yi to the third. Actually, the way it's usually done is to the power fifth, because often third roots don't exist in the fields that we happen to be working with for some technical reasons. But thirds are easier to work with, cubic powers are easier to work with in this example, so that's what I've gone with. And you're also going to check that your yi plus 1 is equal to is equal to xi plus I. And this is something that we're going to compute over and over and over again inside our circuit, just by the nature of the computation. So if we wanted to compute this constraint using just multiplications and additions, we would need to have quite a lot of constraints. Certainly for every cubic power, we would have to compute x squared, and then we'd have to compute x squared times x, and then we'd have to sort of, but before we had to do that, we would have the x plus y in order to get that value, in order to then cube it. It's going to take like a few constraints. Whereas if we have a custom constraint, we can do all of that stuff I was just describing in a single step. In particular, if we choose the custom constraint on the board, so if we choose to have that AI times BI times CI minus DI minus EI, you'll notice there's a couple more columns going on here. We don't just have A, B, C anymore, we now have D and E as well. You can check that all of these constraints are going to be equal to 0, just in one slot. So to check that this is actually computing the function that we want it to be computing, in our very first situation, we have A1 times B1 is equal to C1. We still have copy constraints. We're still able to use our copy constraints in order to put the correct variables in the correct place. So if we have that A1 is equal to B1 is equal to C1, then that's all actually equal to A1, and we have A1 cubed as we need. The second thing that we're going to need to do is, because this is the very first round of our min-root function, we need to input our public inputs. And our public input here is just x1 and y1. That's like the starting point of the function. So we're going to need to copy x1 in. And again, we do that exactly with a copy constraint. And we just check that d1 is equal to x1 and put that in. Likewise, we check that e1 is equal to y1. So then you end up with a1 cubed minus x1 minus y1 is equal to 0. And I claim that because this is the case, if you rearrange it, you actually have that a1 cubed is equal to x1 plus y1, which means that a1 is equal to x1 plus y1 to the third, which is what you actually need. Because computing cubic powers is very fast, but computing things to the power of 1 over 3 is much slower. So that's what we actually want to use for the delay function. In our second constraint, when we copy things in, we're going to get that C2 is equal to x1 plus 1, which again is going to be what we need. So I'm just going to sort of relabel these things, and I'm going to say that x2 is going to be equal to the a1 value of before. And the reason I'm doing this is because x2 is the second point in our step function. And likewise, I'm going to say that y1 is going to be equal to y2 is going to be equal to c2, so that I'm labeling things consistently with the min-root function here. It's just a relabeling, nothing else is happening there. Okay, Our second round is going to look very much like our first round. We're going to have the same custom constraint, we're going to use it again, and we're going to have the same addition constraint then, which we're going to use again. And a few more copy constraints, because copy constraints are going to appear all over the place. And again, when we plug these in, there's something which I've faded out there, which is also going to be brought in. Trust me, that is the correct value. We're going to end up with the A3 cubed. So this is, and we're going to minus A1. A1 is equal to X2. We're going to minus E3. E3 is equal to C2, which is equal to Y2. And we have all of this is equal to 0, which means that A3 is equal to A1 plus C2 to the third, which is equal to X2 plus Y2 to the third, which is exactly equal to your X3. Similarly, your C4 is now going to be equal to X2 plus 2. We're copying in the public value 2 here, which is then equal to Y3. And you're going to continue in this fashion over and over and over and over and over and over again, which means that the number of times that you're using this particular custom constraint is going to be lots of times, so it's going to save you quite a lot of computation. I would say that one thing I've done here is I've chosen a function which is very sequential in nature to get the sort of point of, oh, we're doing the same thing over again, we're using the custom constraint many times, therefore we're able to improve the prover efficiency. For this particular example, it's possible that you might be able to do better. In particular, I'm using copy constraints here. Copy constraints require a permutation argument. There is a bit of overhead for those. Because this is sequential, you might actually be able to use a shift function in order to be able to do even better in this particular example. But if we imagine that this wiring is actually all over the place and you need copy arguments, and you're just working with the Plonkish arithmetization system as it's been described so far, then this is how it would work. Any questions at this step? Yep.
So I guess I'm trying to understand, having a custom constraint, what does that mean? Do we pre-process that as well? How is this more efficient than just what it looks like computing this every time directly?
So I guess the reason it's called a custom constraint is that if you're generating an arithmetic circuit for, not an arithmetic circuit, sorry, a constraint system for, say, a SHA-2, the number of times that you're going to need to use this particular constraint is going to be, I don't know if you would use it at all. I'm going to say that maybe you wouldn't use it at all and it would not be used. So if you were allowing this constraint in that particular proving system, it would strictly be an overhead, something that you wouldn't want, something that you wouldn't want to be accounting for, and you wouldn't use it. But in this particular proving system, because it's coming up many times, it is a constraint that we want. So it's a constraint that I would say is specific to the problem that is being arithmetized at hand, and something which the person who's designing the proof system can decide, I want this custom gate because I think this custom gate is good for my circuit, as opposed to something that would be inbuilt at the point where you're defining your proof system.
I think my question is, I could drop this in as is, but the entire with multiplications and subtractions and additions, every point I want to check. I imagine that's not what we're doing.
No, that's not what we're doing. You kind of can, it is equivalent for sure, but you would need more slots. So in this particular case, I have 4 slots in order to check 2 rounds of this function, whereas if you wanted to do it and you only had just A1 times B1 equals C1, you only had that type of constraint, then it would take you more slots. And more slots means more prover overhead. Does that make sense?
Yeah, what's a slot?
So A1, A2, A3, A4, A5, the size of your witness, how many entries there are in that vector.
Like the number of constraints is the numbers.
Yes. But yeah, notice that the constraints that we're using here, they're not addition constraints, they're not multiplication constraints. Sure, they can be built from additions and multiplications, but they're not directly additions and multiplications. And we're going to use them time and time and time again, and they're very specific to our circuit. If you were to ask me, are there constraints that you might build, some custom constraints that aren't built from addition and multiplication constraints, I'm going to tell you that yes, there are. In fact, lookup constraints would be a classic example of that, but your easiest ones are just going to be built from additions and multiplications.
Is my understanding correct that you cannot support arbitrarily large time parameter, but like you are bound to the size of the CRs? No?
Yes.
And let's say you have 2 to 30 large CRs, what's the time parameter you can support?
I don't actually know the answer to that question. I probably should, but there will be a fixed time parameter. So you need to be able to encode your polynomial commitments, A of x and B of x and C of x. And these are going to have a particular size which is associated to your number of constraints, which is associated to your number of slots. If you have that A of x has degree which is higher than the size of your setup, then that's going to be a polynomial that you actually can't commit to because you just don't have enough powers in your setup in order to compute that value. And actually this is like, I would say a fairly major, I'm going to call it an engineering problem. Getting large setups, like really large setups, is really hard. Like, if you want to have a setup for, say, 1,000 constraints, then having, say, even 1 million people participate in that would be like a very doable thing, because the amount of work that each person needs to do in that setup is going to be quite limited. Whereas once you start talking, no one's managed 2 to the 30, by the way, the maximum anyone's managed is 2 to the 27. Once you start talking 2 to the 27, you're talking about very big parameters that take a very long time to download, and then when you want to actually compute the setup function, this is something that you're going to need like special hardware to be able to do. You're going to need a good laptop, you're going to need it to run over a certain period of time before you can send it back, which really is then going to constrain the number of people you can have take part. And the less people take part, the less open the process is, the more likely it is that there is a problem with your setup and that someone is actually, not someone, and that everyone is actually dishonest. So, yeah, there's both the fact that we want the prover time to be fast, that's constraining sort of what kind of computations that we're able to support, and there's also an actual upper bound on the computations that we can support if we're talking something that's working with a universal setup. So we've got 4 slots here. Again, in each of our 4 slots, we're not checking every single gate at every single slot. Again, we're going to be just selecting the points that we want to use. We're going to use the minroot selector to turn on minroot when we want to apply the minroot function, and we're going to turn on the addition selector when we want to turn on addition. The cost of having these custom constraints, it's not completely free. In particular, this minroot function is going to be something which you're going to need to commit to in your pre-processing. The prover is going to need to evaluate it at a random point, and we're going to need to verify that that evaluation is correct at a random point. A lot of this can be batched with other computations, so the actual overhead is not going to be huge, but you are going to be talking at least 1 field element in your actual proof per custom constraint. So it's not free. You're not going to add custom constraints that you're not using, but it's not expensive either. So if you do have something that you're using a lot, it would be well worth the cost. I think I'm not saying anything interesting there. So if we view this sort of together with the Plonkish diagram that Dan described yesterday, then we can see how it maps in. So we can see that we have 5 variables here, which are going to map into 5 slots in our big table of constraints. So I'm going to sort of say a few things about the trade-offs that are going on here. I'm going to say that each additional column, so when I talk columns, I'm meaning how many A, B, C, D, E do you have? Each additional column in your custom constraints is going to cost you 1 extra polynomial commitment. And because you're having to provide that one extra polynomial commitment, you're also having to open that one extra polynomial commitment. This is going to have an impact on your proof size. Often, actually, the number of columns that people are deciding that they want to work with is not that big. Certainly, you could support something which has lots and lots of columns, but I'm certainly hearing of people that are saying, actually, 4 columns is already expressive enough for us, so we're going to work with 4 columns. And that would already give you much more power than just the initial 3 columns that we were describing at the start. Yeah.
So we commit to each column separately, so each column is correct?
Yes.
I think yesterday at one of the lectures, we were committing to the whole matrix, right? It was a simplification, right?
So in order to run, the way the Plonkish copy constraints work, you're able to check that any value in your matrix is equal to any other value in your matrix. And in order to make that happen, you are going to need to have a polynomial commitment which considers all of your polynomial commitments to all of your columns. The reason we want to be able to separate them like this is so that we can have very expressive custom gates. But when it comes to checking the copy constraints, we're going to line them all up in a row and sort of combine them, and then we'll run the permutation argument over the combined vector commitment.
That's why it's cheaper to have columns separately.
Yes. Yeah, no, separating the columns is for the custom constraints. So for example, here, if you wanted to check that A1 times B1 times C1 minus D1 minus E1 is equal to 0, and you didn't have separate polynomial columns, then you wouldn't in fact be able to just evaluate what is A of x evaluated at a random point. You'd have to figure out a different way of doing that, which then would not allow you such an expressive system. Yep.
I was just wondering, is the main cost just the, like, at the end of the day, the prover needs to interpolate the polynomial on the number of constraint points, and we're just trying to minimize constraints to reduce that cost, or is there some other, like, I guess I'm trying to understand, like, what is the goal or like, of all of this that we're doing now?
So, I'll stay here. The copy constraints that we're working with, in order to enforce our copy constraints, we have to have a permutation argument. Let's forward that, I need. We have to have a permutation argument over our entire table, so our entire matrix. The permutation argument is our biggest cost. It's sort of the thing that is going to really impact your prover time more than anything else, most of the time. So really what you're trying to minimize is the size of this table. So if this table is very, very wide, then that's going to have an impact on the total number of inputs in the table. If it's very, very long, it's going to have a total impact, but you just want to try and minimize it for both length and width. Yep.
Is it correct that the use can use this table because the width of the table is the width of the largest custom constraint, right?
Yes.
So some constraints use fewer slots, but do the remaining slots matter in performance? So if you have like a copy constraint which only use 3 items in a row, the remaining 3 items of these features, do they affect performance?
Kind of no, unfortunately. It would be nice if they didn't, but really your costs are going to be affected by your largest custom constraint. Because you are going to, we're like batch checking everything, we're not checking things individually. And because we're doing this batch checking, if we're paying for the custom constraints at all, then we're paying for the custom constraints.
But they don't have to participate in compilation, because kind of they're not restricted, so we don't have to interpolate to them.
But we're still going to have to compute A of x at a random point, and we're going to have to compute B of x at a random point, and C of x at a random point, and D of x at a random point, and E of x at a random point. And then we're going to have to try and combine those evaluations into our verification equation in the correct point. And the fact that you're not using D of x evaluated at a random point in some of the equations, it doesn't really buy you very much.
So just because you just said that bottleneck is the permutation constraint. So when we do interpolation of the permutation constraint, for
They kind of do. Because like the way you're lining up your vectors for your polynomial constraint, you have your A polynomial, and then you have your B polynomial, and then you have your C polynomial, and then you have your D polynomial. You run a permutation argument over all of that. Your permutation argument isn't going to move everything in this big long vector. Some of those things are going to stay fixed, but that isn't going to help when it comes to the cost. You're still permuting it, you're just permuting it to itself again. One additional thing that's going to affect our costs here is each additional multiplier per custom constraint is going to allow more expressive custom constraints, for sure, but it's going to cost at least an additional field element per proof. And the reason that I say this, if I go back, there are some nice tricks we can do when we're checking these equations, where rather than checking sort of, does A of x evaluate to this point, and B of x evaluate to that point, and C of x evaluate to that point, we take our entire expression, we move everything onto the left-hand side, and we check that everything evaluates to 0. So if we're in a situation where we just have, say, the bottom constraint, and we ignore the selector polynomial, and we're wanting to check that A of x plus B of x minus C of x is equal to 0, then because we have polynomial commitments to A of x and B of x and C of x, and these are homomorphic polynomial commitments, we can add those polynomial commitments up, evaluate them at a random point, check it's equal to 0. Does the prover need to send 0? No, because the verifier already knows it's equal to 0, and that's going to save you a proof element. However, in the multiplication case, polynomial commitment scheme is additively homomorphic, but it is not multiplicatively homomorphic. So we are actually going to have to send, in the min root example, we would have to send an evaluation of A of x and an evaluation of B of x. We wouldn't have to send C of x in order to check this. So that's going to cost a couple of extra field elements. Yes?
It's okay to have gauge share columns, right? It's not wrong.
Sorry?
It's okay to have gauge share columns. So you could have, like, let's say 3 columns for, like, which use for addition, and use the same 3 columns in different row for multiplication.
Yes, you can use each column wherever you want it to be used. That's one of the really nice things about this particular arithmetization system, actually. If you want to use any value which has appeared anywhere, you can. So yeah. Yep.
So I want to ask, things that we saw yesterday look more generic, right? We have these different functionalities with polynomial computation. Here things look much more ad hoc. So if you have a new problem, you just go on with your experience of doing tricks and think, or is there something more methodic that you can apply?
It depends who you are.
So the answer is that it's ad hoc.
The most efficient constraint systems are usually ad hoc, but if you aren't that familiar with finite field arithmetic, you might be better off using a generic compiler, which isn't going to have as good custom constraints, and it isn't going to have as good ways of representing things as you might be able to do by hand, but it might be safer if you don't know what you're doing. But yeah, the general point here is that there is a trade-off between, proof size and verifier time, which we do still care about, and prover time, which we also care about. We care about everything.
One thing I'm confused about is that you commit to each constraint separately, but then you say you can reuse values from one constraint to the other. And you say you have to evaluate polynomials A or B or C at random points. You will be committing to the polynomials A, B, or C. So I'm not sure, if you reuse values, do you still have to do commitments?
So this is kind of where the copy constraints come in. So if you're wanting to reuse, say, A3 in slot 7, then you can't use A3. But you can say that, say, B7 is equal to A3 and use it in that fashion.
And you haven't used B7 before.
And you haven't used B7 before because it's your 7th slot.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. So yeah, up next I'm going to be talking about lookup constraints, which are a very specific type of custom constraint, which are really, really useful. They come up all the time. But before I finish, I am just going to talk about one bonus slide, which has absolutely nothing to do with the rest of this talk. But yesterday I was asked by Paul exactly how you get zero knowledge in like a nice generic way from your Plonk proving system. My answer is that the original Plonk paper came up with a zero knowledge way of getting, well, a method of getting zero knowledge which was actually broken. So it's not something which is completely generic, and it's not something that you can do in, you know, a nice way always, but it is something where there are lots and lots of tricks which often work, which are very easy to do, where really getting zero knowledge is not always the hardest thing in the world. And I'm going to give you a specific example for how you might do that in the multiplication constraint case. So in this particular case, we would be trying to check that a of x times b of x minus c of x vanishes over our domain. Let's say we don't want to send a of x because it contains lots of private information which is very sensitive. And we also don't want to reveal b of x or c of x, like all of it's containing sensitive information. What would we do? Well, rather than commit to a of x directly, we would commit to a of x, and then we would also add on a random amount of our vanishing polynomial. So we'd just take a random blinder r of a and times that by z of x. And we're just going to add that to our polynomial commitment so that when we commit to a of x, it's been blinded. Likewise, we would do the same with b of x and with c of x. Then when we want to check that the multiplication gate is satisfied, that we have something that vanishes over our domain, we're still going to have that we're able to compute a q of x. The q of x is not going to be exactly the same as before. In particular, it now has these blinding values. So rather than just q of x, we now have plus r of a times b of x. We've already committed to b of x. That doesn't cost us anything. We just multiply it by r of x and add it on. Likewise, the a of x we've already committed to. We just add the r of x times a of x and add that on. Z of x is already committed to. We can add r of a times r of b times z of x and add that on. And we can minus rc very cheaply as well. So we can just take the q of x that we had before, add on some values that are all very cheap to compute, and we end up with a new q of x, which is still going to satisfy our new equation with our blinded polynomials. This would be one of the tricks that we would use, and actually one that I use all the time. Cool. With that, thank you very much.